the United States has entered into us, not just financially and commercially and industrially, but politically, emotionally, psychically.
We really have tried very hard to define ourselves as a state, but all we have done is to say, we're not Americans.
Hello. Canada and the United States have been best of friends for a very long time. Presidents and prime ministers like to boast about our undefended border. But today, some Canadians are wondering if there is any border at all. They're worried that American influences are so pervasive that it seems we've already become the 51st state. This week, we will explore every aspect of how the U.S. has come to Canada, in business, movies, politics, how we live our everyday lives. Our special series, What Border, begins tonight. In this documentary, Brian Stewart explains how 3 decades of changing economics have created the Americanization of Canada.
So much of the Canadian story I covered over years was about nationalism.
I am a Canadian and I am a nationalist. I'm a nationalist, I am proud of that too.
How the great moments touched us and changed us.
Those of us who support the free trade agreement, we believe very strongly and sincerely that this agreement will help.
We're very American, and we're becoming more so every day.
Why is the country so hard to grasp now?
It's the insidious nature of the change, and it shows up in a multitude of ways.
This is really sovereignty association. Let us consider the consequences. Let us debate the consequences.
It is change I measure by the past. I feel strange, disoriented, coming back to the site of Expo 67 in Montreal, once the symbol of modern Canadian nationalism. I was a reporter here then and can still remember that swelling pride in our independence and sovereignty. But in my career, I've watched that nationalism rise and then give way in recent years to what some call Americanization of our economy, our symbols, and increasingly even our political discourse. And we seem hardly to notice it anymore or care. Who would have believed then, or even a dozen years ago, that the CPR, the Great Steel Dream, largely built to prevent Americanization, would now stick the stars and stripes on its side and start selling off Canadian lines to U.S. railways? It would have once been unthinkable that Toronto's chief landmark, the CN Tower, would turn itself into a commercial billboard for U.S. business giants. Or that nearby boardrooms would be increasingly occupied by U.S. executives, and that a former Green Beret would guide even the historic Globe and Mail to near evangelical enthusiasm for the U.S.
Stop! Rebound score!
Would any of us have believed then the Americanization of the one sport that binds us? And surely no one would have ever foreseen that the RCMP, as Canadian a symbol as exists, would casually sell all rights to its promotion to Disney Corporation, the Canadian musical ride joining the cartoon pantheon of Mickey Mouse and the Seven Dwarfs.
With regard to the RCMP musical ride, a Canadian national institution being turned over to the clutches of Disneyland, I mean, that was, I can't say that I've seen, hardly can think of a more incompetent public policy decision than that one.
Policies on national energy are...
Some elder statesmen, like former Alberta Premier Peter Lougheed, now warn that loss of our symbols is just the outward sign of our Americanization.
I mean, this is a problem for us more significant by far than any other country in the world, because there is only one superpower and we live right beside it.
Canadians are assured by government and business that changes are just a function of a new global economy. But in reality, it's Americanization. Consider trade with the European community. In 8 years, the percentage of our exports going there has actually dropped to just 6%. And what of our much vaunted trade with the Pacific Rim? It's actually slipped in the same period from 17% to just 12% of the total. The fact is we're ever more in the American orbit. Now 81% of all we export goes directly south to the States. As provinces, we trade even more north-south with the U.S. than with ourselves. That proud standard-bearer of business, the Financial Post, admits, as far as the business of Canada goes, this has become the 51st state. With nary a shot being fired nor a ballot cast, entire sectors of the economy are changing character. Some feel Canadians are in a state of denial, backing into a kind of sovereignty association with the superpower. Again, how incredible. In the Expo year, I witnessed the great emphasis on proving we were not the 51st state by emphasizing Canada's sovereign place in the world. Symbols really mattered. And in the first major story I covered as a newspaper reporter, the Liberal Convention of 1968, the great challenge was to define what distinguished our society from others.
For me, this beautiful, rich, and energetic country of ours can become a model of the just society.
It was, granted, easier to be nationalist then. The U.S. had the Vietnam War, and I remember the convention being interrupted hourly by near surreal reports of race riots in burning U.S. cities.
Violence is continuing to erupt in many cities across the United States. In Washington, bands of Negroes are defying the curfew. At Detroit, the Canadian border has been closed. No one is being allowed to cross the tunnel or bridge leading to Windsor, Ontario.
So on the convention floor those nights, it seemed natural to hear our nationalism exalted.
And I am a Canadian and I am a nationalist. I'm a nationalist, I am proud of that too.
And moderate nationalism was a theme with all main parties in the election campaigns I covered over the next decade. And what most set us apart were national social programs like Medicare and values of collective responsibility for welfare, over the U.S.-style rugged individualism. Government was still respected, as were leading figures like Liberal Mitchell Sharp.
There was an expansion of private incomes such as we'd never seen before. We introduced all the Social Security nets and didn't have a deficit, you know. It's what most people refer to as the golden years. And it was a time when people said, oh, this is a wonderful country, and we've got to be more independent of the Americans and so on, run our own affairs.
Inside number 10, posing for cameras, the official pictures with their foreign ministers, Mitchell Sharp and Michael Stewart.
It was Sharp who warned in the early 70s that Canada could fall to U.S. domination unless we took the famed third option, going all out to build trade with the world so as to lessen Americanization.
We made some progress, but we didn't alter the flow of events. The flow of events was the biggest accessible market for Canadian products was in the United States. And the things that we wanted were produced in the United States, not in Europe.
Today, Sharp worries his worst fears are being realized. There are a number of Canadians, as I'm sure you're aware, that worry that what we have now is not globalization of the economy, but essentially Americanization.
That's right. Yes, and this was my argument. I thought that for the gain that was possible by a free trade agreement, we were paying a high price. In exactly those terms. That what we wanted was globalization. What was offered was continental expansion.
Even conservative Brian Mulroney had warned free trade would be a threat to sovereignty, until he suddenly switched to support the treaty in the mid-'80s as a safer economic course for Canada.
We built a country, east and west and north.
In the 1988 election, Liberal leader John Turner fought emotionally for sovereignty, but lost.
With one signature of a pen, you've reversed that thrown us into the north-south influence of the United States and will reduce us, I'm sure, to a colony of the United States, because when the economic levers go, the political independence is sure to follow.
Mr. Turner, with a document that's cancelable on 6 months' notice? Be serious.
I mean, we lost here in '88. I wish we hadn't, but it happened. You can't undo it.
Even strong opponents of free trade, like left-wing economist Mel Watkins, concede that battle over. But he fears the cost to Canada has yet to be realized.
One of the risks of this continental economic integration is a process of balkanization or of a kind of political disintegration. And I think that's what we're witnessing, and it's not just around Quebec. I mean, each of the regions in Canada is increasingly going to be relating on a north-south basis, which and that's always been an important phenomenon, but now it may become the dominant phenomenon.
It's a great shame, a great missed opportunity in Canadian politics that when we went into free trade, which in my belief we had no choice but to do, I was a free trade supporter, we didn't say stop. This is really sovereignty association. Let us consider the consequences, let us debate the consequences.
Over the years, I've often read Richard Gwynne as he became one of Canada's most prominent political writers. He shares the view that Canadians are in denial over Americanization, perhaps because we're too absorbed by Quebec.
Quebec, in one way or another, has absorbed us for 30 years and is going to absorb us for 5, 10 more. And we're paying a price for that. And the price is that we're not talking about, caring about, arguing about, yelling at each other about becoming two socioeconomic nations, becoming like America. And the United States has entered into us, not just financially and commercially and industrially, but politically, emotionally, psychically. In a certain sense, in a significant sense, the Canadian national economic market no longer exists. We have 5 markets that are attached to the regional markets within the continent. And this has a profound effect on people's attitudes. So does the fact that many, many young Canadians today, and this isn't just simply a function of the United States by any means, are going to have to make their careers in multinationals. They're no longer going to make their careers in Canadian-only companies or in the Canadian government or provincial governments or institutions.
A clear example of this is in Nova Scotia, a province that benefited in the past from national projects. Here, to be more competitive, CP Rail has sold off this line in the Annapolis Valley to a U.S. railway, Iron Road Company of Washington, D.C. So now third-generation CP workers like Barry Buchanan work for American bosses. And they don't seem to mind.
Well, railroading doesn't change. You do the same thing. A new owner just changes the tactic a little bit. Otherwise, we're doing the same thing over and over again, but with progress, I guess you'd say.
Progress, but it does seem strange to ride through Nova Scotia on a U.S. train to pick up gypsum from this U.S.-owned quarry for shipment out to the U.S. market.
That is complete at 12:16, 1216 RTC NDM.
But the American owners do employ 24 Windsor, Nova Scotia locals and seem very efficient. And they're flexible in promoting brakemen and engineers. Here, an engineer, Peter Lang, gets training as a dispatcher.
And we have 4JIP1 out of Wentworth, and that'll be the first set of empties goes to Wentworth.
What part do you like with this part of the job?
Just dispatching the train is something I never thought I'd be doing, and I'm really enjoying it. You know, it's something you really have to use your brain power for with.
Since rail deregulation, CP and CN are planning to sell off 8,000 kilometers of tracks in Canada. Most of the new railways springing up are U.S.-owned or financed. Inevitable or not, another part of our national heritage slips away. It's in the Canadian business centers like Toronto that the U.S. juggernaut is most evident. Giant U.S. financial institutions have poured in $24 billion in just 3 years backing business expansion and greasing the wheels of corporate mergers. It is worth noting this is not the equivalent of European Union, where countries essentially still just trade. Here, two countries are marrying head offices, production, supply, and marketing into one organic whole. For more and more executives, that means submitting to U.S. control.
You either try to swim against the tidal wave or you try to ride the tidal wave in a way that makes some sort of sense.
Ron Vandenberg is a realist, a very successful one. He founded one of Canada's most aggressive strategic marketing firms, which creates corporate marketing and design strategies. But in order to expand into the broader continental free market, he sought out his own takeover by a large American concern, Diefenbach Elkins. By the way, they're the U.S. marketeer that Air Canada went to for its image change. Ron Vandenberg now reports as junior partner to head office, New York.
A symbol of our land for everyone, everywhere.
A lot of high-level marketing jobs have been eliminated from Canadian offices, and that the role of the Canadian office has changed in the multinational network. And if you want to be involved in high-level marketing and strategic decisions, you have to be at the head table. The head table is located at the head office. And while there might have been a time when that discussion would have taken place in Toronto for Pepsi, it may take place now in New York City or in Dallas or in San Francisco.
Despite some Canadian success stories, competition is one-sided. Everywhere, American retail giants are routing Canadian stores at home. In merchandise, in fashion, and certainly in taste.
Coffee latte grande.
Grande latte.
Grande mocha.
And a mocha, grande mocha as well?
Yeah.
Amazing. 1 out of every 3 shopping dollars spent now goes to U.S. chain stores.
On one level, there's a concern about the Americanization of the economy and specifically the retail segment. But on the other level, if consumers are basically satisfied that their needs are being met and they're getting good value and they're happy with the purchase experience, then they'll continue to support these companies and these ventures.
And the marketplace will rule.
And the marketplace will rule.
Now, one reason nationalism is waning is because, well, the U.S. is pretty admirable, and that's not just a throwaway kindness. It is vibrant in ideas and drive, less arrogant now, and Canadians simply like and admire it more and more. So one very welcome change in recent years is a decline in our own self-righteous anti-Americanism, long an ugly rallying point for nationalists.
Anti-Americanism, I think, was without doubt a bulwark of Canada, but was it ever a worthy bulwark? Can you build a nation on hating somebody else?
Jack Granatstein is a leading nationalist historian. In his latest book, ironically titled Yankee Go Home, he argues Canadians from the beginning have used criticism of the states as a self-serving crutch.
I was a devout anti-American. I was always ready to think the worst of the United States for a long time. And God knows some of the things the Americans do still make me furious. We really have tried very hard to define ourselves as a state, but all we have done is to say, we're not Americans. And that's not sufficient anymore to say that. We have to know the things that really tie us together, if there are things that tie us together.
But Granatstein, too, worries we're becoming more Americanized every day, as our own positive nationalism fragments along ethnic, regional, even ideological lines.
I mean, the Canadian public is essentially realizing that there is no one to say, we are Canadian. I mean, what is the effect of destroying the central government, other than to weaken the national presence? Our nationalism has been subdivided by the effects of multiculturalism into hyphenated Canadianism. You're not a Canadian, you're a German Canadian, a Polish Canadian, a Ukrainian Canadian, a black Canadian, a female Canadian.
So if it's Americanization, why aren't we reacting?
Because it's so insidious, and it shows up in a multitude of ways, the way people dress, the way they treat other people, the courtesy, the habits, the way they respond to national institutions.
Canadians are extraordinarily patriotic. I've always found they love to wave the flag, though they claim not to. Government's answer to unity is not to strengthen institutions, but to wave still more flags. But one learns patriotism is easier, less committed than nationalism. Canadians do have many different attitudes from Americans, but our drift towards marriage keeps growing. Some polls show half of us favor a common currency with the U.S. A remarkable 27% would not mind if the border vanished altogether. In English Canada, at every corner, we're inundated with U.S. culture.
Our belief in the principles of self-reliance, of sound finances, of personal responsibility.
We even sound more American as fundamental beliefs shift. A neoconservative ideology from the United States has deeply influenced politics, business, and the media. It echoes the language of anti-government, anti-welfare, rugged individualism.
Hiring by quota and not the merit principle.
Now the ethos in Alberta, in Ontario, and to some substantial extent everywhere in Canada is that government is bad. The smaller the government, the better. Part of this is deficit-driven, but I think a lot of it is ideologically driven. It's creeping Americanization of our politics.
Happy New Year, everyone.
Since free trade, some neoconservative reforms have been positive. But have they also not attacked the very social programs that distinguished us from the U.S.? Medicare, welfare, regional equalization, national efforts to value community over rugged individualism. It's fascinating to look back to 1988 and those heated combats on CBC's The Journal over free trade that pitted top champion of free trade Peter Lougheed against nationalist Maud Barlow of the Council of Canadians.
I sense that Canadians who support this agreement are Canadians who are optimistic, confident, and positive about their country and believe we can compete. And I'm glad I'm on the side of the positive and confident Canadians.
Make no mistake, we cannot integrate our economic systems into a country 10 times larger than ours and maintain our own social programs. You can't do it. It was not going to happen right away, but we will be forced to downgrade. Through this agreement, our concern for social justice will be rendered a trade irritant. Our ability to decide for ourselves what priority we choose will be lost. Thank you.
Well, concern about Americanization makes for strange allies today.
You know, people criticize me, and they say, Peter, but you were one of the main proponents that brought in the free trade agreement, one of the key spokespersons when I was Premier of Alberta. And I did that, though, but fundamental to me was that we exempted from it all of the cultural and institutional elements. I thought we had to do it for economic reasons, but I wanted to make sure that we excluded those things that make us distinctly Canadian.
Lougheed now believes, like Barlow, that we're in the grip of American cultural imperialism, that the new conservatism of the Reform Party, Klein, and Harris tries to graft American ideology onto the Canadian psyche.
I think on the political side, you see some of the elements that have been proposed by various political spokespeople, which weaken the whole concept of the community. Some of it involved in the individual must look after themselves more. Yes, agree, but also we have to look after the less fortunate in our society.
It grates with us. It's like sandpaper for us because it truly does go against our cultural history, that the whole notion that we built something here based on sharing for survival. If we didn't work with each other, we wouldn't have survived as a nation. That's our national narrative.
It's generally a more caring society, and that's been the nature of our social policy, our public policy. And I see that ebbing away to a fair degree.
The language is American. There's common sense, workfare, tax cuts, you know, being on your own. The whole notion of choice, the whole notion of charter schools and choice, health and choice, that's very American. That's come straight out of the heart of Republican America.
But when I went to the recent policy conference of Alberta Conservatives, now gearing up for what's expected to be another Klein victory, delegates were upbeat about their style of conservatism.
Not as much government in your face. That's basically it, just less government. More of a reliance on yourself.
But you don't think it's an Americanism?
Oh, no, I don't think it's an Americanism at all. Not at all. No. And if it were, so what?
Premier Klein himself dismisses the fears.
Well, we're adopting an Alberta philosophy, and the people of this province clearly, if you go back 4 years ago, they clearly said, get your financial house in order. That is not Americanization. That is good, common sense, down-to-earth, conservative, by the way, conservative style politics.
It would be unfair to blame Americanization just on neoconservatives. Across the political spectrum, there's a remarkable absence of national vision. Even budget cutters can't say what will come after all the pain. But what's discordant about the Canadian model of rugged individualism is that it lacks historic roots.
My experience in life is the pendulum shift. And I think we are at the ultimate of the pendulum that has shifted towards the individual above all else. And there is going to be a swing back in our country to the collective, because when I talk to people on the street and ask them questions about what's really important to them, it is their community. It's what we call the pioneer spirit. And what is the pioneer spirit? It's helping one's neighbor. I mean, that's the fundamental difference between the development of Western Canada and Western United States.
But can Americanization ultimately suffocate our independence? The key question. No one I talked to doubted Canada will continue, barring the separation of Quebec, of course.
There's nothing with quite the survival value of nation states. They're constantly being written off, again and again, in the face of something called the world economy, globalization. Their days are numbered, and the right says it, the left says it, yet somehow they just hang around.
There's absolutely no evidence that Canadians want to become American. The evidence is contrary, that Canadians have a deep pride and attachment to this place, although if you then say to them, what is Canadian, you get a long silence and sort of a pawing in the ground, which doesn't matter. If you care about something, then that something is going to exist because you care about it.
We are part and parcel of this continent. Our attitudes, our values are shaped by where we live and how we live, and that is, for the most part, the same way Americans live. So there's no point in our trying to deny what we are. We are Americans. What we have to do is find the things that can tie us together so that we don't become United Statesians, and that becomes harder and harder to do.
We approach a critical moment, near overwhelmed by American influence, at the very time we struggle for unity within. 85 years ago, Prime Minister Robert Borden said that the core question before this nation always is whether Canadianism or continentalism will dominate in this northern land, a question equally valid today and even more pressing. Well, through this week, other reports on the National will examine the challenge to Canadian sovereignty and national attitudes in this new era of fading borders.
Crossing the border into Windsor and just experiencing this big relief. I'm back in Canada.
I don't feel as secure living in Quebec as I did, for instance, living in Chicago.
Canadians are so overwhelmed by American metaphors that they take them on uncritically.
We are a country of immigrants. Like all great cliches, this one conveys a fundamental truth. And one of the great strands of our immigrant foundation is, surprisingly, American. Americans have been coming here since before Canada was Canada. Escaping slavery, the lure of the North, fleeing an unpopular war, Americans have come here in legions. And this is a tale of what a handful of those Americans have found here.
Hi, where do you live? Your citizenship?
Canadian.
How long have you been away?
The world's largest undefended border has always been a fairly porous affair, perhaps never more so than the period just a few car styles back, approximately 30 years ago. The most profound transformations in American life in the second half of this century came during the tumultuous 1960s, and the great precipitant of those changes was the vastly divisive engagement of the Americans in Vietnam. American blood spilled abroad in a morally uncertain war, devastating images nightly brought home to an anguished America. At the absolute center of this moral dilemma were thousands of young men called up by the draft who found themselves unwilling or unable to serve their country in the Vietnam Crusade. They fled their native land. And many of those who came to Canada weren't looking for an alternate society. They wanted simply the nearest way out. Charles Belcher is a deserter now living in Vancouver. He was already in basic training with the Marines when the infamous killing of 4 students during a protest at Kent State galvanized him into a decision that the U.S. at that time was not a country he was going to fight for.
I mean, that was really shocking. I remember thinking, like, this government is really going crazy because they're killing their own people, their own kids. And that I didn't think it was appropriate for me to be one of their representatives at that point.
Charles Belcher knew he had to leave his country. The choice of where to go came from an unlikely travel guide.
I was reading a Playboy magazine one day, and they had a thing on Montreal. You know, I was kind of curious about Montreal. It was a city I didn't know much about. And like most Americans, my idea of Canada was like, you know, Eskimos and a whole lot of snow and all this kind of stuff. So I saw this thing about Playboy Club in Montreal, and I was reading it, flipping through, and all of a sudden I came to this one page, and it was just one black guy sitting there in the club. So I said to myself, well, if they're civilized enough to have a Playboy Club, and there's already one black guy up there, I might as well go.
Despite the unique recommendation, Montreal was only his first stop. Eventually, this quiet, engaged American came to Vancouver. Here, he works with teenagers.
Hands up. Okay, Jim, you got to do a good rebounding, huh? And Gerard, you the big.
He also spends his time as a volunteer in various sports programs.
All right, take it out, guys.
He sees Canada as a place where social challenges can still successfully be met.
I think the American society has like so many more ills and maybe so much more of it. I think the problems have been allowed to grow to the extent that I got a cousin, she works in the social service system in the United States, and I wouldn't do her job. I don't know. I don't think that it's supported enough, and in a way, I'm glad to be in the sort of position I'm in because I can contribute to it. I can contribute to the problems that are here and trying to make them better. But I think the situation in the United States, I wouldn't take this kind of position, no.
Charles lives with his wife and daughter in the downtown of the one city some of us Canadians see as our most contemporary. Living in the diverse cosmopolitan setting of Vancouver makes a difference. For him anyway, it takes the edge off race as a focus.
I think once they find out that I'm American, then I think they have a tendency to ease off because they feel like, oh, you've been already treated too bad already by these Americans, so like, you know, we'll give you the benefit of the doubt. Yeah. So, you know, I think there's been a lot of attempts to to present to make me feel like an honorary white in some instances.
Yeah.
I think the door has been pretty open, and you know, blatant racism is it's nothing compared to what I experienced in Georgia. Let's put it like that. So I think Spike Lee came up when he did Jungle Fever, and they asked him, like, "Oh, Spike, what do you think about racism in Canada and all that?" I thought he had a good answer. He said, "Well, there's racism in Canada, but the United States, they're the leaders. They're the ones that's really invented this thing and really perpetrating it." So.
Since the general amnesty that was granted all who fled the Vietnam War, returning is no longer risky. Charles makes occasional visits to his first home in the U.S., but tells of a physical sense he feels whenever he crosses the border. It's a signature of difference.
I can remember going to Detroit, Michigan. A friend of mine, he lives in Detroit, and we used to go visit there, to visit his home. And I don't remember what the circumstances was of the visit, but I remember crossing the border into Windsor and just experiencing this big relief. I'm back in Canada. The concerns that I had in Detroit, I didn't have them in Windsor. So I think in the capsule, that's sort of like, I think lifestyle here is gentler in some way. It's not as harsh as America. I think there's more opportunities for you to live a good life.
Just as in the 60s there were a number of Americans who came to Canada as draft dodgers escaping a war, earlier on there was something of a reverse process. In the beginning of World War II, the Americans established a number of military bases in Newfoundland. And since that time, over 100,000 Americans have been stationed here, and many, many more have passed through. The American military presence in Newfoundland has had a pervasive and rich impact. This was history unfurling. The bases the Americans acquired in 1941 were the first overt signs that America was to be engaged in the Second World War. And from the very first moment that the Americans in their thousands arrived in what was to be the 10th province, some of them felt the allure of place and people.
It was meant to be that the American and the Newfoundland people were meant to come together and be as one.
U.S.-born John Cardolis has written of the American presence in a book called The Friendly Invasion.
From the very beginning, when the Americans first arrived here in 1941, there was a special bond that was created between the two nations. It always had been there, because we know from back in history that thousands of Newfoundlanders had migrated to the United States prior to the Americans' military arriving here. And then a great bond was formed, of course, when the Americans came. They were part of the culture, you know. To walk down the street and see an American in uniform, no matter what type of uniform, it was a part of day routine. The Americans had the money, their customs were different. One lady said to me when I was writing my book, you know, she said, the first time ever I tasted a hot dog was when I first associated with the Americans.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America.
Some of those Americans that stayed, in a sense, played against the stereotype of their national character. They were captured by Newfoundland, the ways of the place. It wasn't flight, it was willing embrace. And they find no confusion in hanging on to some of their old military loyalties, which is why they meet under the aegis of the American Legion and have once a month for 50 years. One such American loyalist, Newfoundland Canadian, is Bernard Agresti, who came to Newfoundland, a fresh-faced serviceman from Baltimore, met the woman he was to marry, a young girl from Ferryland, in a St. John's diner. Bernard Agresti seems to have made the transition from the U.S. to the outport with ease.
Honestly, I don't see a great deal of difference. The only thing I'm aware of is that with the economic situation in the States, it's more rush and being there on the minute, and Newfoundland is more relaxed and less stressful. My wife and I have often discussed that the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence, but it's the side of the fence you make the best do with, and that's your best place.
Yeah.
So we never really wanted to go to the States.
Relics of the American presence are a few street names on the no longer American base. Those who came to Newfoundland arrived by virtue of the great public event of a world war and stayed for quiet, sometimes singular, essentially private reasons. The chance romance, the wilderness appeal of Newfoundland, the serene life of a hard place. Some Americans, we would assume, travel north or decide to live here because of our celebrated tranquilities. Well, maybe. Take the case of Chicago sports writer and columnist Linda Kay. She decided to pitch her tent in Quebec at a time when Montreal is a cauldron of language strife and political faction.
As Americans, we think of Canadians as our friendly neighbor to the north, and they're just like us. But they're really not just like us, and their country is really not just like us, and their politics is really not just like us, and their political system is not like us. So there were a lot of differences to get used to.
Linda Kay, a decade or so ago, was an award-winning columnist who didn't know much about Canada, but because her column was a sports one, she did know hockey. That, she found, was a good start with her future husband Bernard, who still plays, and her future country, which is still together. It was romance and the thought of building a bilingual family which persuaded her to start her career over. She arrived when Montreal was shaken with the horror of the crazed shooting of 14 female students at the École Polytechnique.
In a horrific 20-minute rampage, Marc Lapine fired more than 60 times.
My first story here was the École Polytechnique massacre. So, welcome to Canada. My husband had told me, oh, you'll feel so great in Canada, you'll feel so safe in Canada. And I got here and this thing occurred.
Something that we said only happened in America.
Exactly, exactly. Which, again, is something that I find the attitudes of Canadians, yes. So, I'm covering this. And I covered the first night initially, and then I went back the next day and there was a viewing of the caskets. I naturally went forward to get some comments from the mayor, from the councilwoman, from the police person, from anyone who would speak to me. And I noticed, I looked behind me, and everybody is standing there. And I said, well, aren't you going to talk to these people? Oh no, we have to give them their respect. And I was stunned. And I thought about this very much because I didn't go. Because I felt like, oh, I'm in this country, maybe this is the way they do things here. And later I regretted it because as a journalist, I find it a very constricting kind of way to work because you're always censoring yourself in some ways. You don't want to offend or you don't want to intrude or you really can't ask this. And I'm not sure why Canadians are like that. I think they have a bigger regard for personal privacy. But maybe it's also, another part of it is maybe it's also a fear of getting into trouble or getting too involved.
The charm of old Montreal, the idea of Montreal as a city of elan and romance, is still quite real for Linda Kay. She's writing a book about romantic Montreal. But then there's political Quebec, and politics in this case is personal. Her husband is an ardent separatist. What all refer to as the language question in Quebec is again on top of the political menu. The experience of being in the middle of all this is running counter to one dream Linda Kay had in coming to Canada in the first place.
You gotta order in French too.
Oui, monsieur. I came here filled with the idealism of a bilingual country and how wonderful it is to have two cultures, two languages in a country, and came here with that idealism and then found out that that was not the reality.
Canada is not a real country. There are two people, two nations, and two territories. And this one is ours.
In terms of politics, which is more tranquil, Chicago or Montreal?
I have to say Chicago. I have to say Chicago. This has been a very tumultuous time here in Quebec. I lived through hard situations in Chicago. The election of the first black mayor when I was in Chicago. But nothing like this. Nothing like the daily, it invades everything that you do here. There's just this sense that when you're English, it's a bit different. It's a bit different. And I find that for me, it's been actually easier being an American, an English-speaking an American, because people give me the benefit of the doubt. But they do not give English Canadians the benefit of the doubt. The sense of unease I have is I don't feel as secure living in Quebec as I did, for instance, living in Chicago. I mean, there was no question about my future in the global sense. I might question, well, did I want to stay with the particular aspect of the job that I was doing? Or maybe I might want to look for another apartment someplace, but it wasn't the grand questions like, what's going to happen to this place? Is it going to become its own nation? It's a sense of security that I miss. I feel that I'm living almost lightly tiptoeing on the edge here. I cannot feel like I'm setting down roots, although I am setting down roots.
In any significant sense, are you going to postpone your commitment to this place until this thing is settled? In a real sense?
Yes.
If things turn nasty after the next referendum, are you going to go?
Yes. I've already told my husband that. Yes. And how nasty is nasty? That's the question. What can I live with?
Linda Kay is looking at scenes from the troubled Canadian marriage. One of the great emerging dynamics of Canada is the growing relationship fueled by immigration and commerce between the countries of the Pacific Rim and our own. And it's interesting that it's an expatriate American who's one of the keener students of that phenomenon. Professor Michael Goldberg is Dean of Commerce at the University of British Columbia, and he's an authority on Canadian trade relations.
I think Canada is seen as an honest broker worldwide. And we're not seen as people who play games with geopolitics. We're seen as being fair, small, and honorable people. So it gives us a base for dealing with people, which is a very solid base. In Asia, people do business on trust. Canada's trustworthy. That's a huge advantage. The U.S. is seen as less trustworthy. The U.S. is seen as more bullying. And as a result, people prefer to diversify their trade relationships outside the U.S., and Canada is a very logical choice.
Professor Goldberg came to Canada 28 years ago. He's part of a minor wave of American academics that during the Vietnam and post-Vietnam period entered the Canadian university system. He found Canada attractive, married a Canadian, settled, and raised a family. One of his first projects was a study on the contrast between our cities and those of his Native American.
I came up from a country where cities were falling apart, and we had all this legislation to destroy the center of cities, build freeways, and build public housing. And I come up here, and I traveled in my first year to half a dozen different Canadian cities, and I heard about Canada's urban crisis. Well, I looked around and I couldn't find it. And there wasn't any place in '68 which was anywhere near like the US cities. So that kind of put this hypothesis in my head that Canadians are so overwhelmed by American metaphors that they take them on uncritically.
The most worthy difference Goldberg sees between us and the Americans is Canada's wider understanding of social responsibility.
Canadians understand in their soul that a healthy society is a mix between individual rights and collective rights. Canada has a tremendous sense of fair play. And if you look at our social programs, I see them as an expression of the desire to treat people honorably. And you see that repeated in the foreign affairs realm, where we have this incredible reputation because we do have this sense of fair play. The only place I see that play out in a negative way is I think we are modest to a fault, to the fact that we are so self-effacing and so honorable and accommodating that we tend not to step back and honor our heroes and honor the kinds of things we've done, which are really pretty laudatory.
Being American in Canada is a various affair. Charles Belcher, John Cardolis, Bernard Agresti, and Michael Goldberg made their choices to come here under their very individual pressures and in answer to very distinct personal motives. Each of them, differently, offers confirmation of some of our more treasured ideas of ourselves. We're in the main more quiet, but then there's Linda Kay's Quebec. Our social and political environment is less harsh. We are more or less a welcoming people. And we are, too, as their stories show, much closer in our social and cultural idioms, certainly on the personal plane, than we Canadians sometimes allow. But then, I suppose, that's why we call them cousins in the first place. For The National, I'm Rex Murphy.